Chapter 10. The Place of Imperialism in History. We have seen that in its economic essence, imperialism is monopoly capitalism. This in itself determines its place in history. For monopoly that grows out of the soil of free competition, and precisely out of free competition, is the transition from the capitalist system to a higher socio-economic order. We must take special note of the four principal types of monopoly, or principal manifestations of monopoly capitalism, which are characteristic of the epoch we are examining. Firstly, monopoly arose out of the concentration of production at a very high stage. This refers to the monopolist capitalist associations, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. We have seen the important part these play in present-day economic life. At the beginning of the 20th century, monopolies had acquired complete supremacy in the advanced countries, and although the first steps towards the formation of the cartels were taken by countries enjoying the protection of high tariffs, Germany, America, Great Britain, with her system of free trade, revealed the same basic phenomenon. Only a little later, namely, the birth of monopoly out of the concentration of production. Secondly, monopolies have stimulated the seizure of the most important sources of raw materials, especially for the basic and most cartelized industries in capitalist society, the coal and iron industries. The monopoly of the most important sources of raw materials has enormously increased the power of big capital and has sharpened the antagonism between cartelized and non-cartelized industry. Thirdly, monopoly has sprung from the banks. The banks have developed from modest middleman enterprises into the monopolists of finance capital. Some 3 to 5 of the biggest banks in each of the foremost capitalist countries have achieved the personal link-up between industrial and bank capital, and have concentrated in their hands the control of thousands upon thousands of millions, which form the greater part of the capital and income of entire countries. A financial oligarchy, which throws a close network of dependence relationships over all the economic and political institutions of present-day bourgeois society without exception, such is the most striking manifestation of this monopoly. Fourthly, monopoly has grown out of colonial policy to the numerous old motives of colonial policy. Finance capital has added the struggle for the sources of raw materials, for the export of capital, for spheres of influence, i.e., for spheres for profitable deals, concessions, monopoly profits, and so on. Economic territory in general. When the colonies of the European powers, for instance, comprised only 1/10 of the territory of Africa, as was the case in 1876, colonial policy was able to develop, by methods other than those of monopoly, by the free grabbing of territories, so to speak. But when 9/10 of Africa had been seized by 1900, when the whole world had been divided up, there was inevitably ushered in the era of monopoly possession of colonies and, consequently, of particularly intense struggle for the division and the redivision of the world. The extent to which monopolist capital has intensified all the contradictions of capitalism is generally known. It is sufficient to mention the high cost of living and the tyranny of the cartels. This intensification of contradictions constitutes the most powerful driving force of the transitional period of history, which began from the time of the final victory of world finance capital. Monopolies, oligarchy, the striving for domination and not for freedom, the exploitation of an increasing number of small or weak nations by a handful of the richest of the most powerful nations. All these have given birth to those distinctive characteristics of imperialism which compel us to define it as parasitic or decaying capitalism. more and more prominently there emerges, as one of the tendencies of imperialism, the creation of the rentier state, the usurer state, in which the bourgeoisie, to an ever-increasing degree, lives on the proceeds of capital exports and by clipping coupons. It would be a mistake to believe that this tendency to decay precludes the rapid growth of capitalism. It does not. In the epoch of imperialism, certain branches of industry, certain strata of the bourgeoisie, and certain countries betray, to a greater or lesser degree, now one and now another of these tendencies. On the whole, capitalism is growing far more rapidly than before, but this growth is not only becoming more and more uneven in general, its unevenness also manifests itself, in particular, in the decay of the countries which are richest in capital, Britain. In regard to the rapidity of Germany's economic development, Reiser, the author of the book on the big German banks, states, "The progress of the preceding period, 1848 to 70, which had not been exactly slow, compares with the rapidity with which the whole of Germany's national economy, and with it German banking, progressed during this period, 1870 to 1905, in about the same way as the speed of the mail coach in the good old days compares with the speed of the present-day automobile, which is whizzing past so fast that it endangers not only innocent pedestrians in its path, but also the occupants of the car." In its turn, this finance capital, which has grown with such extraordinary rapidity, is not unwilling, precisely because it has grown so quickly, to pass on to a more tranquil possession of colonies which have to be seized, and not only by peaceful methods, from richer nations. In the United States, economic development in the last decades has been even more rapid than in Germany, and for this very reason, the parasitic features of modern American capitalism have stood out with particular prominence. On the other hand, a comparison of, say, the Republican American bourgeoisie with the monarchist Japanese or German bourgeoisie shows that the most pronounced political distinction diminishes to an extreme degree in the epoch of imperialism. Not because it is unimportant in general, but because in all these cases we are talking about a bourgeoisie which has definite features of parasitism. The receipt of high monopoly profits by the capitalists in one of the numerous branches of industry, in one of the numerous countries, etc., makes it economically possible for them to bribe certain sections of the workers, and for a time a fairly considerable minority of them, and win them to the side of the bourgeoisie of a given industry or given nation against all the others. The intensification of antagonisms between imperialist nations for the division of the world increases this urge, and so there is created that bond between imperialism and opportunism, which revealed itself first and most clearly in Great Britain, owing to the fact that certain features of imperialist development were observable there much earlier than in other countries. Some writers, L. Martov, for example, are prone to wave aside the connection between imperialism and opportunism in the working class movement, a particularly glaring fact at the present time, by resorting to official optimism, a la Kautsky and Huysmans, like the following: "The cause of the opponents of capitalism would be hopeless if it were progressive capitalism that led to the increase of opportunism, or if it were the best paid workers who were inclined towards opportunism, etc." We must have no illusions about optimism of this kind. It is optimism in respect of opportunism. It is optimism which serves to conceal opportunism. As a matter of fact, the extraordinary rapidity and the particularly revolting character of the development of opportunism is by no means a guarantee that its victory will be durable. The rapid growth of a painful abscess on a healthy body can only cause it to burst more quickly and thus relieve the body of it. The most dangerous of all in this respect are those who do not wish to understand that the fight against imperialism is a sham and humbug unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism. From all that has been said in this book on the economic essence of imperialism, it follows that we must define it as capitalism in transition, or, more precisely, a moribund capitalism. It is very instructive in this respect to note that bourgeois economists, in describing modern capitalism, frequently employ catchwords and phrases like interlocking, absence of isolation, etc., in conformity with their functions and course of development. Banks are not purely private business enterprises. They are more and more outgrowing the spheres of purely private business regulation. And this very Reiser, whose words I have just quoted, declares with all seriousness that the prophecy of the Marxists concerning socialization has not come true. What then does this catchword, interlocking, express? It merely expresses the most striking feature of the process going on before our eyes. It shows that the observer counts the separate trees but cannot see the woods. It slavishly copies the superficial, the fortuitous, the chaotic. It reveals the observer as one who is overwhelmed by the mass of raw material and is utterly incapable of appreciating its meaning and importance. Ownership of shares, the relations between owners of private property, interlock in a haphazard way. But underlying this interlocking, its very base, are the changing social relations of production. When a big enterprise assumes gigantic proportions and, on the basis of an exact computation of mass data, organizes according to plan the supply of primary raw materials to the extent of 2/3 or 3/4 of all that is necessary for tens of millions of people. When the raw materials are transported in a systematic and organized manner to the most suitable places of production, sometimes situated hundreds or thousands of miles from each other, when a single center directs all the consecutive stages of processing the material right up to the manufacture of numerous varieties of finished articles, when these products are distributed according to a single plan among tens and hundreds of millions of consumers, the marketing of oil in America and Germany by American Oil Trust, then it becomes evident that we have socialization of production and not mere interlocking. That private economic and private property relations constitute a shell which no longer fits its contents, a shell which must inevitably decay if its removal is artificially delayed, a shell which may remain in a state of decay for a fairly long period, if, at the worst, the cure of the opportunist abscess is protracted, but which will inevitably be removed. The enthusiastic admirer of German imperialism, Schultz Gavernitz, exclaims, "Once the supreme management of the German banks has been entrusted to the hands of a dozen persons, their activity is even today more significant for the public good than that of the majority of the minister state. The interlocking of bankers, ministers, magnates of industry, and rentiers is here conveniently forgotten. If we imagine the development of those tendencies we have noted carried to their logical conclusion, we will have the money capital of the nation united in the banks themselves combined into cartels, the investment capital of the nation cast in the shape of securities. Then the forecast of that genius, Saint Simon, will be fulfilled. The present anarchy of production, which corresponds to the fact that economic relations are developing without uniform regulation, must make way for organization and production. Production will no longer be directed by isolated manufacturers, independent of each other and ignorant of man's economic needs. That will be done by a certain public institution, a central committee of management, being able to survey the large field of social economy from a more elevated point of view, will regulate it for the benefit of the whole of society, will put the means of production into suitable hands, and above all, will take care that there will be constant harmony between production and consumption. Institutions already exist which have assumed as part of their functions a certain organization of economic labor, the banks. We are still a long way from the fulfillment of St. Simon's forecast, but we are on the way towards it. Marxism, different from what Marx imagined, but different only in form. A crushing refutation of Marx indeed, which retreats a step from Marx's precise scientific analysis to St. Simon's guesswork, the guesswork of a genius, but guesswork all the same.